Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're going to be looking at the penultimate parable in our reading this liturgical year through Matthew's Gospel, the parable of the talents. Before we get started on this, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, and you can find the link to that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So then, without further ado, let's dive into this week's text, which comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, verses 14 through to 30. We find ourselves in the midst of the drama of Holy Week, and as we learnt in chapter 24, verse 1, Jesus had left the Jerusalem temple and was now teaching his disciples on the Mount of Olives. That teaching had followed a series of disputations with various members of the religious authorities, covering chapter 21, verse 23, all the way through to chapter 23, verse 39. Now, Matthew 24 and 25 are generally believed to go together in one section. The focus in Matthew 25 is twofold. Partly it's eschatological, it's about end times, following on from the multiple eschatological warnings of Matthew 24. But it's also about getting Israel ready to be able to receive the kingdom of God breaking in the here and now. So we have something of that now and not yet dimension of God's kingdom at work. This parable is the second of a set of 3 parables, extended parables, that we find in Matthew 25. Last week we looked at chapter 25 verses 1 to 13 and the parable of the oil lamps. Next week we'll look at chapter 25 verses 31 through to 46 and the parable of the sheep and the goats. But this week we focus on the middle parable. And it's generally accepted that Matthew 24 and 25, and according to some commentators also Matthew 23, form part of one of the 5 blocks of teaching that we find within Matthew's Gospel, perhaps mirroring the 5 books of the Torah, the law of Moses. Now in this reading we have Jesus coming not just to the end of his public ministry, but to the end of his life. And he's teaching the disciples who will soon have to take on the baton and, as chapter 28 verses 16 to 20 puts it, go out and make disciples of all nations. We've got those disciples who include, but are not limited to, the 12 who formed the inner circle of Jesus' group. And as I said, they were being gotten ready to take on the ministry of Jesus. And there's much in these parables in chapter 25, which I think is about discipleship fundamentally, and what that means and looks like. Now, the context in which we're talking about discipleship here is that of Matthew's Gospel, the second of the canonical Gospels to be written, around 75 to 80 of the Common Era. It was written to the most overtly grounded in what we now call Second Temple Judaism, the most overtly Jewish of the 4 Gospels, but also written after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, with its devastating effect on the identity of God's people. And that seems to be what it's like to live under a Roman Empire which has destroyed so much of what was held dear. A really key backdrop to this gospel. Now, as is often the case, we might want to look at some other texts as we grapple with this parable about the coming kingdom. We might, for example, look at Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 24 and 25, as the source of the quotation used in chapter 25, verse 29 of Matthew's Gospel. We may also want to look at Luke chapter 19, verses 11 to 27, which is another and later version of the same story that we find here. Now, the parable of the talents is, I think, a much misunderstood parable. A talent was a sum of money, an absolutely huge sum of money actually, equivalent to what a labourer might expect to earn in about 15 years. Our word in English, word talent, derives from the Greek word talanton that's used here. But that Greek word does not have the connotations it does in English of talents being about our gifts and skills and aptitudes. The focus in the parable very much is on large sums of money. I've heard many a sermon which has talked about this parable in terms of not wasting our God-given gifts and skills and using them to further the kingdom, which is a perfectly laudable message, but it's not what Jesus is getting at here. Talanton here is a large sum of money. Now, the character of the master in verse 14 represents the kind of figure that people would honestly have ordinarily been aware of. An example of someone who is a wealthy business owner who is going away on another business trip, we see in verse 14. And in his absence, this master hands out funds to various servants according to their proven track record, as it were. We see from verse 15, 16, 17 and 18. In verses 16 and 17, the judgment of the master, who gives 5 talents to one servant and 2 to another, would seem later on to be vindicated. But the third servant, as we hear in verse 18, was only allotted 1 talent. They've sometimes been described by commentators as a timid servant or a faithless servant. And it's true that compared to the other 2, they've been given the least. But we do have to remember they were still being trusted with a vast amount of money, so 15 years worth of wages. We can't make a direct equivalence into today's money, but I think we can picture it as a few £100,000, so certainly not pocket money. Now, the 2 servants who doubled the master's money, we learn in the repetitive structure of verses 19 through to 23, were described by the master as good and faithful servants. They'd been trusted with some things, now they would be trusted with more, and they were to enter into their master's joy. But we learn in verses 24 and 25 that the third servant, rather than going away and doubling the money that they were given, went and buried it, went and hid it, because it seems they were afraid of the consequences if they lost any of what was their master's. The servant portrays the master as someone who is dishonest, who is harsh, who reaps where they did not sow, for example. It's likely that, again, we're talking about a believable figure in the culture of that time, perhaps an unsympathetic landlord who would confiscate crops from tenants if they fell behind on their rent payments, with relatively little mercy or understanding given. As we read this text, it might sound peculiar to us that somebody went away and buried the talent so as not to lose it. But actually, in a context without banks as we know them today as safe places to deposit money, burying your treasure was a very sensible way of trying to hold on to valuables. And we see that echoed in the short parable of the buried treasure back in chapter 13, verse 44. So while it may seem sort of strange to us culturally, what the servant does is not outrageous in the worldview of the time. Now, I think it's notable in verse 26, and in many ways I think this is the heart of the parable, that the master doesn't seriously dispute the portrayal of him as being harsh and dishonest that the third servant puts forward. It does rather imply that the master knows themselves to be these things, even if they don't necessarily like it being spelt out. In verse 27, the master rebukes the servant for not at least using the talent to gain interest by investing it. Now we need to note that it was illegal for Jewish people to collect interest from other Jews according to the law of Moses, even as it was okay to charge interest to Gentiles. So we might reference Exodus chapter 22 verse 25, Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 19 and 20, or Leviticus chapter 25 verses 36 to 37. So this was a well-known commandment. The results of the servant's decision to bury the talent rather than investing it or doing other things with it to increase the amount of wealth are seen in verses 28 to 30, and they are predictably harsh. We learn in verse 28 that the servant is deprived of the one talent that he'd been entrusted to look after. In verse 29, that's justified by arguing that those who have been given some will be given more, and those who have nothing will have even that taken away from them. And finally, in verse 30, we're told that this particular servant will be cast out into the outer darkness, where, to use Matthew's familiar formula, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So what's going on here? What's this parable about if it isn't about an exhortation to use our God-given gifts and skills? Or else, it seems. Well, if you look at different commentaries on this passage, they reach different conclusions. Warren Carter, in his commentary on this passage, comes from a liberation theology perspective and treats the figure of the master as representing God. So for Carter, the problem here is that Matthew is so bound up in a worldview shaped by the Roman Empire and by the exploitation of the poor that he can't separate the culture that's around him from the countercultural nature of the kingdom of God. And instead, Matthew puts them together in a way that portrays God as oppressive. So for Warren Carter, we need to challenge the words that are put into Jesus' mouth here, rather than accepting them as a picture of what God is like. So that's one view. In his commentary, Craig Evans speculates that verse 29, that bit about if you've got some, more will be given to you, if you've got nothing, it will be taken away from you, is actually a later addition to the text of this parable. So Matthew has inserted it rather than it being original to what Jesus has to say. And for Evans, what this additional verse serves to do is to focus the meaning of this parable for Matthew's community. Evans argues that those in Matthew's faith community who are not taking God's work seriously are going to be in for a real shock once they hear this. And for him, the imagery in verse 30 about outer darkness and gnashing of teeth is imagery about hell. It's imagery about divine judgment, so on those who are not putting their discipleship into practice. And elsewhere, we have seen Jesus remind people that they need to take discipleship really seriously. He rejected some of those who wanted to become Jesus's disciples, but other things, other immediate priorities were in the way. So that's another view. Yet another comes from Tom Wright, who makes an equivalence between the third servant and the Pharisees and the scribes that Jesus had been railing against back in Matthew 23. He argues that they are people, those Pharisees and scribes, who have failed to shine out the light that was given to God's people Israel, taking us back to chapter 5, verses 14 to 16, where in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about his disciples as the light of the world. Wright also says, interestingly, given his interpretation of the parable of the talents, that Jesus himself would be cast out into the outer darkness of Golgotha when he was crucified, a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, if ever there was one. So those three views of Carter, of Evans and of Wright seem to take it as read that the Master is God the Father, a reading from the centre, you might say. But what if, instead, we read from the margins, as Barbara Reid does? She argues that one of the difficulties in making sense of this parable is that the lens through which we look at it has been so shaped by the capitalist society around us that we can miss the fact that Jesus didn't live in that kind of society. Instead, he lived in a world that was shaped by the concept of limited good. And limited good basically means that if one person's wealth increases, it takes away from the wealth of another. So if you have someone who amasses more and more and more and more for themselves, Reid argues they would have been viewed as greedy, as a wicked person. And so in her interpretation of this, the Master does not represent God, but an exploitative tyrant who takes away from the wealth of others, who economically oppresses others by trying to accumulate more and more and more for themselves, and praises the first two servants because they helped them do that. In Barbara Reid's interpretation of this text, it's actually the third servant who is the honourable one, because despite the personal cost for themselves, despite being thrown into the outer darkness, they are the ones who refuse to collaborate with their master's exploitation of the poor. And again, one might make the connection perhaps between the third servant and Jesus. This reading from the margins rather than the centre might remind us of where we looked at the parable of the wedding banquet in chapter 22, verses 1 to 14, where we get a very different picture depending on how we view the figure there, again, of the king. So, undoubtedly, this is a challenging parable. And as I say, there were a range of possible interpretations of it. And what I've put forward before you is by no means fully comprehensive in terms of the possible range of interpretation. I think the reading from the margins makes the most sense to me. And it certainly challenges those of us who are used to living in a culture so shaped by Christendom and Christianity being at the heart of power and bound up with state power. Perhaps it's a reading that reminds us that that's just not how things were for those early Christian communities. And maybe we need to get back to a view more from the margins if we're really to make sense of the parables of Jesus. With that thought in mind, we now turn to our questions for this week.